In November 1095 at the Council of Claremore in France, Pope Urban issued his famous call to arms, urging Christians to take up the cross and embark on a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem and other sacred lands from Muslim music control. In the 11th century, a new and powerful force, the Seljuk Turks, emerged within the Islamic world. Originally nomadic tribes from Central Asia, they converted to Islam and after a series of military victories established themselves as the dominant power in the Middle East. By the late 11th century, the Seljuk Turks had expanded their empire westward, capturing Baghdad in 1055 and taking control of large parts of the Byzantine Empire after their victory at the Battle of Manat in 1071. Due to this, Emperor Alexios of Constantinople was forced to seek help from the West. Europe answered, and one of the largest armies of the time, music, gathered. This army was 70,000 men strong and consisted of knights and soldiers from all over Europe. The crusade was led by some of the most powerful nobles of France, many of whom left everything behind, including two of France's most important leaders at the time, Adhemar of Loo and Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse. The armies arrived in Constantinople with little food and expected provisions and help from Alexios. The Crusaders may have expected Alexios to become their leader, but he had no interest in joining them and was mainly concerned with transporting them into Asia as quickly as possible in return for food and supplies. Alexios requested the leaders to swear fealty to him and promised to return to the Byzantine Empire any land recovered from the Turks. Godfrey was the first to take the oath, and almost all the other leaders followed him before ensuring that the various armies were shuttled across the Bosporus. Alexios advised the leaders on how best to deal with the Seljuk armies, that they would soon encounter the Crusader army crossed into Asia in the first half of 1097. Their first target was music. This was a city once under Byzantine rule but had become the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate upon the Crusaders' arrival on the 14th of May 1097. The city was subjected to siege. Kilij Aran, the Sultan of the Seljuks, soon found out and gathered an army to lift the siege. On the 16th of May, his force attacked the Crusader army. Music is music. See applause. Music. He was driven back by the unexpectedly large Crusader force with heavy losses being suffered on both sides in the ensuing battle. The siege continued and the Turkish garrison finally surrendered on the 18th of June. There was some discontent amongst the Franks, who were forbidden from looting this city. This was ameliorated by Alexis financially rewarding the Crusaders. At the end of June, the Crusaders marched on through Anatolia. They were accompanied by some Byzantine troops under Taishos, and they still harbored the hope that Alexios would send a full Byzantine army to support them. They also divided the army into two more easily managed groups, one contingent led by the Normans and the other by the French. Music. The two groups intended to meet again at Durham, but on the 1st of July the Normans, who had marched ahead of the French, were attacked by Music. The Normans deployed in a tight-knit defensive formation surrounding all their equipment and the non-combatants who had followed them along the journey, and sent for help from the other group. With his army of horse archers, Aaron began surrounding the Crusader. Music. Applause. Music. Position. The Crusaders were constantly harassed by horse music archers soon after the French arrived. Music. The Turks, who had expected to destroy the Normans and did not anticipate the quick arrival of the French, fled rather than faced the combined Crusader army. From then on, the Crusaders' march through Anatolia was unopposed, but the journey was unpleasant, as Aaron had burned and destroyed everything he left behind in his armies. Flight. It was the middle of summer and the Crusaders had very little food and water. Many men and horses died. The Crusaders looted and pillaged whenever the opportunity presented itself. Individual leaders continued to dispute the overall leadership, although none of them were powerful enough to take command on their music. On the Crusader army had marched on to Antioch, situated midway between Constantinople and Jerusalem. Antioch was extensive and heavily fortified. The idea of taking the city by assault was a discouraging one to the Crusaders, and so the Crusader army began a siege on the 20th of October, 1097. Antioch was so large that the Crusaders did not have enough troops to fully surround it, and as a result it was able to stay partially supplied. By January, the attritional 8-month siege led to hundreds or possibly thousands of Crusaders dying of starvation. In March, a small English fleet arrived with supplies along with renewed foraging systems, and this eased the situation. Meanwhile, Koga, who was a Seljuk Turk commander, raised a coalition from southern Syria, northern Iraq, and Anatolia with the ambition of extending his power from Syria to the Mediterranean. Back at Antioch, Bunt persuaded the other Crusader leaders that if Antioch fell he would keep it for himself, and that an Armenian commander of a section of the city's walls had agreed to allow the Crusaders to enter. The Armenian Faris helped Beaumont and a small party enter the city on the 2nd of June and open a gate, at which point horns were sounded. The city's Christian majority opened the other gates, and the Crusaders entered. In the sack they killed most of the Muslim inhabitants and many Christian Greeks, Syrians, and Armenians. In the confusion, looks though aren't enough to kill. 1 month later, the vanguard of Koga's 40,000-strong army arrived and surrounded the Franks from the 10th of June for 4 days. Waves of Kaboga men attacked the city walls from dawn until dusk. Knowing having limited success, Kaboga then changed tactics to try to starve the Crusaders out. Morale inside the city was low and defeat looked imminent. The Franks sought terms for surrender that were refused on the 28th of June, 1098. At dawn, the Franks marched out of the city in 4 battle groups to engage the music enemy. The discipline of the Muslim army did not hold, and a disorderly attack was launched. Applause. Applause. With very few casualties, the Muslim army broke and fled the battle. Music. Following the battle, Bund asserted his claim to Antioch, but not everyone agreed. So the crusade was delayed for the rest of the year, while the nobles argued amongst themselves. During this time a plague broke out, killing many in the army. There were now even fewer horses than before. And worse, the Muslim peasants in the area refused to supply the Crusaders with food. At the same time, the minor knights and soldiers had become increasingly restless and threatened to continue to Jerusalem without their squabbling leaders. Finally, at the beginning of 1099, the march restarted, leaving Boon behind as the first prince of Antioch. Music. Proceeding down the Mediterranean coast, the Crusaders encountered little resistance, as local rulers preferred to make peace with them and furnish them with supplies rather than fight. The Crusader forces began to grow, with Robert Curius and Tancred agreeing to become vassals. The Crusaders then initiated a siege of Ara, a city in northern Lebanon, on the 14th of February 1099. During the siege the situation was tense. Among the military leaders there had been no real leader of the crusade, and this led to struggles for power. The siege of Ara lasted until the 13th of May, when the Crusaders left, having captured music. Nothing at Jerusalem. The Fatimids had recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljuks and attempted to make a deal with the Crusaders, promising freedom of passage to any pilgrims to the Holy Land on the condition that the Crusaders not advance into their domains, but this was rejected. The Fatimid Ifar al-Daw was governor of Jerusalem and well aware of the Crusaders' intentions, so he expelled all of Jerusalem's Christian inhabitants. On the 7th of June the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. Many Crusaders wept upon seeing the city they had journeyed so long to reach. The Crusaders' arrival at Jerusalem revealed an arid countryside, lacking in water or food supplies. Here there was no prospect of relief. By the time the Crusader army reached Jerusalem, it had been estimated that only about 12,000 men, including 1,500 cavalry, remained. There was no hope of trying to blockade the city as they had at Antioch. The Crusaders had insufficient troops, supplies, and time. Instead, they resolved to take the city by assault, while Godfrey and Tancred made camp to the north of the city. Raymond made his to the south. On the 13th of June the Crusaders began the first assault. During this first assault many Crusaders did not take part due to the divisions in music leadership. The Crusaders managed to reach the walls with ladders, and a battle began for the walls. The men who had climbed the walls were killed. Seeing this, the rest of the Crusaders who partook in the first assault retreated. After the failure of the initial assault, a meeting between the various leaders was organized, and it was agreed that a more concentrated attack would be required in the future. On the 17th of June a party of Genoese mariners under Guglielmo Ambriaco arrived and provided the Crusaders with skilled engineers and, perhaps more critically, supplies of timber to build siege engines. News arrived shortly after that a Fatim relief army had set off from Egypt, giving the Crusaders a very strong incentive to make another assault on the music city. The final assault on Jerusalem began soon after this information reached the Crusaders. A final push was launched at both ends of the city. Raymond's troops attacked the south gate, while the other contingents attacked the northern wall. On the northern side the Crusaders scaled the walls and began to capture music. Then the speed at which the Crusaders reached the walls caused a panic, and the defenders soon abandoned the walls, allowing the Crusaders to enter the city. After the successful assault on the northern wall, the defenders fled to the Temple Mount. Pursued by Tancred and his men, the defenders formed up around the temple and mounted their last stand. Them music. When the city defenses dwindled, the Crusaders stormed through the city and massacred the music inhabitants. With the Crusaders now in the city, Raymond and his men marched into the city. Ifar Allah, the commander of the garrison, struck a deal with Raymond, surrendering the citadel in return for being granted safe passage to Ascalon. The slaughter continued for the rest of the day. Muslims were indiscriminately killed, and the Jewish people who had taken refuge in their synagogue died when it was burnt down by the Crusaders. Jerusalem had fallen. Music. On the 22nd of July a council was held in the Church of the Holy Silar to establish governance for Jerusalem. Godfrey was then elected leader, accepting the title Advocatus Sancti Sepulchre, or Defender of the Holy Silar. The majority of Crusaders now considered their pilgrimage complete and returned home. Only 300 knights and 2,000 infantry remained to defend the city. There were many who had gone home before reaching Jerusalem, and many who had never left Europe at all when the success of the crusade became known. These people were mocked and scorned by their families and threatened with excommunication by the Pope back at home. In Western Europe, those who had survived to reach Jerusalem were treated as heroes. The First Crusade had a profound and lasting impact on both Europe and the Near East. It marked the beginning of a series of military campaigns that would continue for centuries as Europeans sought to maintain control of the Holy Land and expand their influence In the Mediterranean, the Crusades also played a key role in shaping European identity, reinforcing the concept of Christendom and deepening the divide between Christianity and Islam.